Thank you very much for coming along today, and particularly thanks to Jenny, who's going to present to us here. Jenny Murphy has a background in athletic therapy and training, as well as expertise in sports performance. She is now doing her PhD on the topic of replicability in sports science, and is a member of the newly opened Sports Science Replication Centre in Technological University Dublin, and she's going to fill us in today about this replication project that is going on in collaboration with the other guys in the Replication Centre there. I see Joe hi, is there too. So without further ado, over to you. Looking forward to learning more about the project. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Emer, and I guess thanks to everyone at STORK for inviting me to give this talk as well. And thanks to everyone for coming along as well. So I'm really excited today to talk about the Sports Science Replication Centre. But first of all, I'm kind of going to give a brief overview of replication in sports science as well. So I will try and keep this talk short enough, so maybe around 35 minutes, just that if anybody has any questions or even any discussion points as well, so that we have a bit of time at the end to talk about those as well. So as Emer just mentioned, my background is in athletic therapy. So I kind of started off in that profession, and I didn't stay in that too long because I guess I became very frustrated with the use of treatments and things with poor scientific evidence. So I kind of quickly moved out of that field and I moved into research. So currently at the moment, I'm a PhD researcher in Technological University Dublin, and I'm based in Tala in Ireland. And my project is going to be on evaluating the replicability of sports science research. So I'm funded by the Irish Research Council, and I'm supervised by Dr. Joe Warren. And all credit due to Joe, he's the brains behind this project and the one who got it off the ground. And luckily we were successful in receiving 2 funded scholarships. So therefore Christian came and joined us in January after I started in October. So it's quite early days yet, but it's very exciting, especially to get the 2 projects going at the same time. So what is replication? And I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but I will just provide a brief overview for those of you that don't. So replication is retesting a claim using the same analysis and new data. So therefore you would take an original study, you would use the same methods and analysis, and you would recruit a new sample, thereby collecting new data, and then you would compare your results of your replication study to your original study and see do you get similar results. So when discussing the topic of replication, the term reproducibility is often associated with it. And these terms are different, but quite often they have been used interchangeably in the past, and that can lead to a little bit of confusion. So the term reproducibility was originally used to indicate a transparency rather than corroboration. But now reproducibility has been defined as retesting a claim using the same analysis and the same data. So therefore you would take the original data set, or you would contact your original authors for the raw data, you would conduct the same analysis, and then again you would compare the results of your replication study to the original study to see do you get similar results. So there are many different types of replication, and there's lots of different terms. So there are exact replications, systematic, direct, conceptual, close, literal, and operational. So loads of different terms. But these can be simplified right down, because an exact replication is very similar to a literal replication, which is also called a direct replication. A systematic replication is the same thing as a conceptual replication. And then an operational replication is very similar to a close replication. So that makes it a little bit easier to describe these 3 types then. So a direct replication are those that are based on the exact conditions and procedures that are used in the original study. So therefore there should be no deviation away from the original procedures. On the other hand then, conceptual replications provide evidence about the validity of a hypothesized relationship. And they do this by trying to generalize a theory by using different manipulations or a slight deviation away from the original study procedures. So an example of that may be if there was a study that was looking at the effect of altitude on running economy, for example. You could operationalize your altitude in a different manner. So instead of using maybe 2,500 like the original study, you would use 3,500 for altitude in the replication study. And that would be a conceptual replication. So it's really important that in a conceptual replication, it's a purposeful deviation away from the original procedures. So there is also a compelling debate in the literature that direct replications are impossible to conduct, as the researcher would have to conduct the replication in an identical environment with an identical population to the original study, which of course is not very feasible. There are naturally some differences between the original and the replication study, as there could be a different sample, and even the passage of time has occurred, for example. So that's where the definition of close replication was developed, and it was introduced by Brandt. So in the Sports Science Replication Centre, we will focus on close replications, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. So I suppose the big question is, why should we replicate? And kind of to take a step backwards, I guess, the ultimate goal of science is to advance knowledge. But in order to advance knowledge, we need confidence in those findings. And I really like this definition of rigorous science that was sent to me recently. And rigorous science is the theoretical or experimental approaches undertaken in a way that enhances confidence in the veracity of their findings. So veracity in this context means truth or accuracy. And then related to that quote is another quote by Carl Sagan in 1997, who said that at the heart of science is essentially a balance between two seemingly contradictory attitudes. So there has to be an openness to new ideas, and there has to be a ruthless scrutiny or skepticism of all ideas, both old and new ideas. And that is how we separate deep truths from deep nonsense. And replication can help with that balance of attitudes. And then similarly, usually in research, we draw inferences about a population based on data collected in a sample. And quite often the knowledge that we gain is quite uncertain. So therefore, one goal of replication is to increase our confidence in the findings. And we do this by combining existing knowledge with new knowledge by providing new evidence through our replication studies. And then, of course, replication can reaffirm our findings, it can update boundaries on the external validity of our effects, and it can also help to identify potential type 1 errors or false positive. So originally, replication kind of gained attention in psychology, and that's mainly due to a highly publicized case of fraud and the failure to replicate a pretty popular study by Darrell Bem. But I guess the thought of replication is only seeping through the sports science field at the moment, but that's not really good news for us, because unfortunately I think the field of sports science is lagging behind psychology in terms of our open science practices, as very little research has actually investigated the quality and reliability of our findings in the sports and exercise science field. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the problems with sports science, and these are, I guess, some of the key issues that researchers are concerned with and kind of frequently talking about in the literature at the moment. So first of all, we have a huge issue of focusing on novel or exciting effects. And this has led to significant bias, whereby we want positive or significant results as we want to get published. There is this kind of publish or perish attitude in that we need to be publishing papers in order to advance our careers. And in turn, then, this has resulted from the publication bias, as journals want those exciting or novel effects to increase their journal metrics. And that completely creates a false perception of the truth if we're only publishing the novel or exciting effects. And then similarly, we do have a problem with low statistical power and small sample sizes in the field. And this is no secret, and there has been kind of previous publications on this issue in the past. So in 2020, ABT had a look at 120 articles in the Journal of Sports Science and found that the median sample size was 19, which is quite small. And then similarly in 2011, Knudsen assessed 3 applied biomechanics journals and found that the median sample size was between 12 and 18. So again, these are really small numbers. And these are much lower than the median sample sizes you find in psychology literature, and they are already talking about statistical power issues. Thirdly, I guess like any other field, we do suffer from questionable research practices, and this could be p-hacking, multiple analysis, optional stopping, harking, and then of course sometimes our questionable research practices are linked to our lack of transparency in the field. So for how we report our procedures, how we share our code and raw data, and I guess we're a little bit secretive by nature. We don't want to share our messy raw data states or mistakes with somebody else. And then lastly, due to the nature of this field, we do have an invested interest in the outcomes of our research findings, as they can have huge commercial implications. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of the problems with sports science, but these are probably some of the key issues that do affect replicability in the field. So I guess due to the overlap of our field with psychology and due to some of the issues mentioned on the previous slide, it's very likely that we as a field are suffering the same fate as psychology. But I guess it's not all doom and gloom. There have already been calls for replication and to increase the transparency in the way we conduct research. And there's also been an increase in the conversation around collaboration with other researchers and statisticians. And the reason there are these increased conversations are thanks to groups like STORK, who are discussing these issues. And of course, there are some journals now who are adopting the use of registered reports and pre-registration and advocating for data sharing as well. So hopefully these things will become the norm in the future. And now we have the first large replication project in the field, which is the Sports Science Replication Centre. Now, of course, there has been single replications in the field previously, but this is the first field-wide assessment of replicability. So what are we doing at the Sports Science Replication Centre? Well, our overall aim is to evaluate the replicability of sports science research. And as part of my PhD research, I will focus on quartile 1 journals, and as part of Christian's PhD research, he will focus on the lower quartiles, so quartiles 2 to 4. And in order to achieve our overall aim, our objectives are to establish a collaborative lab network worldwide, to undertake replication trials of different effects, to report replication outcomes using meta-analytic procedures, and to present an initial overview of replicability of sports science research. So obviously this is going to be a hugely collaborative project, but not just in terms of the replication trials and the volunteer labs, but in the design of the protocols and guidelines. You know, this is completely new ground for us. It's the first of its kind in the field. So therefore, to try and help us with this, we have created an advisory board with researchers across different disciplines. And some of these people do have experience in running replication trials and studies. So hopefully then they can help us create and maybe endorse guidelines and procedures and basically just guide us into really unknown territory from here out. But thankfully, we can model off some previous large replication projects. So there has been many labs. There has been the reproducibility project in psychology, the reproducibility project in cancer biology, social science, economics, and I'm sure I've missed a few there as well. So there are different ways to conduct these large replication projects though. So first of all, there could be multiple replications of one single effect. And this would be an example of many labs. So they selected 13 effects, so a very small number of effects, but they replicated these effects many times across 36 different samples and settings. So they were doing multiple replications of single effects. On the other hand, then, there could be single replications of multiple effects. And the reproducibility project is an example of this, where they selected a wide range of effects across the field and they conducted single replications of these effects. So they had, I think, 100 effects that they replicated. And we are also going to follow this method whereby we will be conducting single replications of a wide spread of effects across the field, because we feel like that this is the first natural step in assessing replicability of the field and to give us an overview of it. So just to give you a quick snapshot of our current kind of short-term timeline. So at the moment, we're finalizing our selection protocol. So we needed obviously, you know, a standardized protocol for selecting our studies to replicate. And we will upload that as a preprint shortly. So hopefully that will be available in the next week or so. We are also currently working on a survey and we will pre-register that shortly as well. And of course, we'll distribute it then afterwards. And with the survey, then we're going to be exploring the attitudes and perceptions of sports and exercise science researchers towards reproducibility and replicability in the field. And then next month in May, we are hoping to start our lab recruitment drive. And of course, the whole success of this project completely relies on volunteer labs. So therefore, we need to try and recruit as many as we possibly can. And then over the summer, of course, we're going to allocate each of our volunteer labs their replication study. And this is going to follow a stratified random sampling method, which I'll explain a little bit more about later on. And after this, then we're going to individually pre-register each replication study. And of course, in the meantime, then we'll be sorting out our ethics and we'll have a data sharing agreement in place. So the overall goal then for this year, I guess, is to get a data collection phase going in October of this year, or possibly sometime in the new academic year. And we are aware this is completely COVID dependent. So it depends, I think, you know, what the COVID restrictions are like in different countries and things like that. So we may have to be a bit flexible with this start date as well. So overall, we're hoping to conduct 3 main phases of replications of data collection to inform our final report as well. So as I've just mentioned, the success of this whole entire thing completely relies on volunteer labs. So we need them to run replication trials and contribute towards this replication movement in the field. So who do we need? So we need sports and exercise science researchers, research groups or labs, and it doesn't really matter what part of the world you are in, although preferably you may be able to speak English or Spanish, as these are the 2 main languages we're going to work in. And also it doesn't really matter what sort of equipment or anything you have, because we will match based on what you have readily available in the labs. So our suggestions then for conducting a replication study are that if you have the means and time to do it, conduct it yourself. Otherwise, if you can't do that, maybe as part of a closely supervised undergraduate project, research internship, or even a postgraduate project if that's possible. And of course, we must insist that it is a closely supervised replication, of course, because we are intending to do close replication. So therefore, they need to adhere to the sample guidelines and the procedural guidelines as well, of course. So there should be minimal cost for labs, as we don't expect anyone to buy lots of new equipment or anything, but there may be small consumable costs. So we are, of course, applying for external funding to help us with this, and we know there are, you know, undergraduate consumable budgets available for research projects too. So hopefully the cost will be very, very minimal to labs. So I guess the big question is why? You know, why should you volunteer with us? And there are a lot of different reasons. And I guess the most obvious one is that you can contribute towards the first collaborative replication project in sports and exercise science. You know, previously in the literature, there has been different articles which have advocated for replication studies or saying we must do this. And, you know, I guess at this time now, we don't really need much more published studies saying we need to do this or we must do this. We must actually, you know, do it. It's the time for action in order to try and decrease some of the issues that I mentioned earlier in this field. So some labs may not be able to run replication studies in all the phases we're completing, or they may be limited by time or equipment, but that's fine. We will try and match as best we can, and we just really need people to volunteer. We're going to try to be flexible as best we can, and that's why we have a system in place to stratify the studies as well. So the second reason is that you can lead the way towards open science in the field. And I guess open science is almost like a buzz term at the moment, and every research field is talking about it and making changes. And really, that we need to do the same. We need to do the same to improve the quality of the research that we conduct. Thirdly, all methods and analysis are pre-planned by the team leader, so there's no additional thinking about the research design or what analysis you should run, as it is completely pre-planned. And similarly then, the final report and analysis will be completed by us as well. Next then, each lab will receive a study that is feasible to conduct. So we know what we're asking labs to do, so we want to really make it as easy as possible for them, I guess. And feasibility here means equipment and software and expertise, because as I mentioned, we're going to try to match the labs as best we can while being unbiased. And then finally, each author who makes a substantial contribution to the project will receive authorship as well. So this will be as per the ICMJE guidelines, and it'll be similar to the previous large replication projects, such as the reproducibility project in psychology as well. So next, I'm just going to talk you through our selection protocol. So how are we selecting the studies we're going to replicate? And this is going to be important for our volunteer labs, as they want to know this information as well. So there are several steps for inclusion, exclusion criteria to create our final pool of studies for replication, because of course we can't absolutely replicate everything in the field. So I'll just talk you through the steps now. So first of all, we're going to look at the year of publication and the journal ranking. So we want to include research that is currently relevant, and currently relevant research questions that are of importance or value to the field. So therefore, we're going to focus on recent research. So that will be research that has been published in the last 5 years from the date of each stage of the replication effort. So as I said, we're going to be doing 3 data collection phases. And similarly then, for my project, I'm going to focus on quartile 1 journals. So I undertook an observational task before putting the selection protocol together, and found that researchers mostly cited articles from this quartile, regardless of the quartile they published in. So due to the frequency of citations in quartile 1 journals, and for the use of this information by practitioners, we will focus on this one. In terms of our research discipline then, we're going to be looking at applied sport and exercise science. So the reason we're looking at applied research is we feel subjectively, I guess, that it's of highest replication value to the field and to other practitioners in the field. And also, of course, we're limited by resources, so we need to focus on one specific area. And within this research discipline, then we're going to focus on the sub-disciplines of injury prevention, sports and exercise nutrition, applied sports and exercise biomechanics, psychology, and physiology as well. So the next steps in our protocol, we will then include or exclude studies based on the study type. So we're going to include studies that are experimental or quasi-experimental quantitative studies, whereby an independent variable is manipulated to have an effect on a dependent variable. And this could include pairwise or independent study designs and across 2 or more groups. And we will also only include studies which have a statistically significant main effect. Similarly, in the original study, ideally they'll report the means, the effect size, and the confidence intervals, or we should have the ability to calculate this information from the raw data. And this information is really important because we need this for the assessment of the replication outcomes and to compare the replication study to the original study. In terms of our research question and key variable then, this might be a little bit tricky as we're only replicating one dependent variable. So this dependent variable should be stated in the abstract, in the first or primary hypothesis, or even defined as important by the author's language. But also, of course, if it is the only applied sports and exercise science variable within that paper, we will only replicate that variable as well. Next then, our inclusion criteria will consider methods and feasibility. So as I've already mentioned, we're hoping to conduct a close replication. So therefore, we need to plan our replication studies as closely as possible to our original studies. So therefore, that we can eliminate alternative explanations for our replication outcomes. So therefore, ideally, the original study will report full sample details, because this will inform our replication study and, you know, our recruitment for our replication study in terms of total sample size and the sample characteristics as well, so that we can control for any confounding factors. Ideally then there will be also full information on the instrumentation details, and in terms of this I mean equipment and software and manufacturer details as well. So we need to be able to match the laboratories, our volunteer laboratories, to these studies so that there will be those minimal costs as well. And of course, any differences between the replication and the original study will be completely transparently reported as per Brandt's replication recipe. Finally then, for study methods, ideally there would be information on boundary conditions or delimitations in the original study. And then in some of our replication designs, we may have to measure an additional variable to make the replication close, but only use the key dependent variable for analysis. So you might have noticed I kept saying ideally before each of these. So obviously that is in the most ideal scenario, that all that information is available in the original study. But I know that that's not exactly realistic because of the reporting quality across the sports and exercise science research. So therefore, we will contact all original authors so that we can maximize the replication quality and so that they can endorse our replication methods as well. And of course, we'll report everything on this process as well. In terms of feasibility then, we're only going to focus on prospective studies that are acute or short-term studies. So they have to be 12 weeks or less. And, you know, we need to, again, you know, limit what we are trying to replicate. And also we want to try and find a balance with volunteer labs. We can't expect the volunteer labs to replicate longitudinal studies for us. And anyway, there's probably lots of shorter acute studies in the literature at the moment as well. And then in terms of statistical analysis, previous replication projects have recommended that the key dependent variable should be evaluated with a single inference test in the original study. So therefore, we will include studies that have used single inference tests, such as the t-test, for example, or the main effect of an f-test. So in terms of our allocation of the replication studies to the labs, as I mentioned, it'll follow a stratified random sampling method. And the reason we're stratifying them is we need to consider the feasibility again in terms of the equipment, software, expertise required, and even maybe the sample to be recruited. So therefore, only labs that can feasibly run the replication study will be allocated that study. And in some cases, some studies might be comfortably ran within a lab's consumable budget, whereas another laboratory might have financial constraints. And then similarly, some studies might require specific equipment or software. And so we'll try and match the laboratories where this instrumentation is readily available, or even available to purchase through a small consumables budget as well. So after we go through all our inclusion and exclusion criteria for our selection protocol, we will end up with a final pool of studies for replication. And within this large final pool, we are going to have our smaller stratified pools. And as I mentioned, these will be stratified by expertise and by equipment, so that when we're recruiting our laboratories too, they will fill out the information on what they have available in the lab in terms of the equipment, etc. So therefore, based off this, we're going to be able to match a volunteer lab to that stratified pool. And then out of that pool, we will randomly allocate them a study. And the reason we're including some randomization into this process is that we want to try and decrease the bias, the selection bias, so that labs aren't picking a replication study because they think it's going to replicate or not replicate. So we want to try and make sure this whole process is as unbiased as possible. So once the laboratories have been allocated a replication study, they will do a final feasibility check just to make sure that they have everything, and maybe that they were matched with the correct pool, for example. And if there is issues at this stage, they can return the study to the pool and they will be randomly allocated another. But that is the only reason that a laboratory can return a study to the pool. And again, we have to try and enforce this in order to reduce the selection bias. So we think it is essential to match our replication studies to the laboratories to avoid excluding studies with expensive equipment or specific expertise, because we want to try and give a representative overview of replicability of the field. And by excluding these studies, that would decrease the representativeness of the replication study pool. So the Many Labs project was heavily criticized in their replication study for using easy to run studies. And of course, all of this information is going to be discussed on an individual basis with each of the volunteer labs. So in terms of conducting the replication, statistical power and sample size planning is an exceptionally important consideration. Traditionally, statistical power calculations are based on original effect size estimates. And the reproducibility project in psychology was heavily criticized for the use of the original effect size estimates in their statistical power calculations, because these effect sizes can be inflated due to publication bias, low original study power, even questionable research practices such as p-hacking and multiple analysis. So the sample effect size as well is also presumed to be a fixed point or a point estimate, but there's always uncertainty around this effect, as the value has a distribution for estimating the true population effect size. So therefore, the sample effect size could be an overestimation of the true population effect size. And that's a huge problem for us and any replication studies in general, because that would mean the actual statistical power is lower than intended. So therefore, for our replication studies, we are going to aim for high-powered replication studies, and we're also going to use Anderson and Kelly's R package, which adjusts for publication bias and effect size uncertainty. And of course, then the replication sample size will never be smaller than the original sample size as well. In terms of actually running the replication study, then of course the first port of call is that we need to have ethical approval, and each of the volunteer labs will get local ethical approval from their research ethics committee before we move on with the replication study, and they'll have to send the approval back to us. And then, of course, we're going to have a data sharing agreement in place, which will be signed by both parties. And then after that, as I mentioned, in order to have a close replication, the volunteer lab will have to closely follow the sample guidelines when recruiting new participants, and then follow the procedural guidelines as best they can, and maybe report on any differences that were unavoidable. So they go ahead and they collect their data, and then they'll send the raw data back to us then for analysis. So in terms of assessing the replication outcomes, there are many different methods in the literature, and no singular method, like anything, is advantageous over another. They all have their pros and cons. So rather, a multiple inferential strategy is probably the best approach. And for us then, a successful replication will be one where the replication effect size is statistically significant and in the same direction as the original effect size. And we know there probably will be some criticisms for the use of null hypothesis significance testing here because of its well-described issues in the literature. And of course, due to p-value variability as well. But this is still a widely used statistical procedure in the field of sports and exercise science, so we will use this information to compare the replication study to the original study. But of course, due to the limitations I was just mentioning, we will use confidence intervals too. So then also in order to be a successful replication, the original effect size must fall into the 95% confidence interval of the replication effect size. We will also include some descriptive information, of course, and this will be the normalized differences in the magnitude of the effect sizes, the final number of included and excluded studies as per the selection protocol, and we'll also include information about the original author response rates as well. So what then? So we need to report the outcome. So we're either going to have successful replications or failed replications, or of course a combination of both. And I think successful replications are probably a little bit easier to understand because they increase our confidence in the original effect and they add to the body of evidence available for that finding or effect. A failure to replicate, on the other hand, is a little bit more difficult to define. So what does it mean? But first of all, what are the reasons a study could fail to replicate? So a study could fail to replicate because the original effect was false. And this could be completely due to chance. It could be also due to questionable research practices or too much statistical analysis freedom. We don't really know. It could also fail to replicate because the replication is false. So for example, if the replication wasn't sufficiently powered to detect the effect. And this again reiterates the importance of having statistical power, high statistical power, because this will be less likely to happen. Thirdly, there could be a failed replication because the methods differed in the replication study from the original in a way that was absolutely critical for obtaining the true effect. And that tells us more about the external validity of that effect, that it's not as generalizable to other settings or samples as well, for example. And of course, finally, there could be an error in the original or replication study, and this may be in the implementation or the analysis. We don't really know. Of course, all humans will make mistakes. So there is kind of a common misconception that failure to replicate are inconclusive or they don't tell us anything. But that's not necessarily true, because within sports and exercise science research, I think sometimes we're a little bit guilty of overgeneralizing our results. But if the result of a replication study doesn't hold with a different sample, the effect is obviously not as robust as we first thought. And this is really important information. The information that we publish is going to be directly used by practitioners, so they need to know whether their effect is robust or not, because some of these findings can influence sports performance outcomes, for example. So regardless of whether the replication is successful or it's a failed replication, this is all need to know information, as it can all update our evidence about certain effects. So I think I've mainly talked a lot about what we're going to do and what our plans are for the project, but I think it's also really important to understand, what this project is not. And I think it's in our human nature to feel defensive about our work. Some people might think this is an attack on their work or a personal attack on research in the field, or that everyone in the field is doing shoddy research. But that's not the case. We're not targeting anyone. It's not to say that our research is going to be perfect. I'm sure there'll be plenty criticisms of this project and some of the methods we use. And similarly, this is not the final evaluation of replicability. Earlier, I mentioned that one of our objectives in the Sports Science Replication Centre is to present an initial overview of replicability in the field. And that word is important. It's the initial overview of replicability. So even if we wanted to present a final evaluation, that means we would have to replicate statistically significant and non-significant effects. And this wouldn't even be enough. We'd still need to replicate all published and non-published research. And even then, a true representative sample would mean that we'd have to replicate everything from the beginning of time, which is clearly not possible. However, we can increase the accuracy of our estimation by recruiting more volunteer labs, hopefully. So in the future then, I guess, maybe future directions of the Sports Science Replication Centre or replication in the field. If we do have a poor replication rate, maybe we could focus on replicating specific sub-disciplines. We're probably not going to have enough statistical power for a comparison of the disciplines in our study and to really kind of give an estimation of replicability of each sub-discipline. Similarly, we could start replicating popular effects or landmark effects in the fields. We could focus on replicating our own studies and even encouraging replications for, undergraduates who are doing final year research projects or even as part of research methods projects. We could also start replicating effects or claims which are within our own personal interests. We could focus on highly cited effects, which are more than likely related to popular effects, of course. And then we could also focus on moving towards conceptual replications of particular effects, to test the generalization of these effects. And of course, one I've forgotten is that we could expand the replications to include other statistical analysis. There's lots of different routes to be taken in the future if we do find, an original poor replication rate as well. But of course, if the replication rate is high, well, then that's fantastic. But at least we've increased the conversation around replication and transparency in sports science as well. So there are some potential considerations and barriers that we have to, that we are going to expect to face. And I know I'm already talking about the difficulties that we expect to face and we haven't even started, but there are some barriers that we will need to overcome. So first of all, there may be a lack of responses from original authors or collaborators. And that is a really important barrier, to be honest, because obviously we need the raw data to calculate the effect sizes or the confidence intervals if they're not freely available in the published research article. But unfortunately, based on our pilot testing, we do expect low response rates. Similarly, another barrier we could face are unclear methods. So that could be unclear sample details or other procedural descriptions as well. So as I mentioned, we need to conduct close replications. So we need to have as much information as possible from the original study. Otherwise, we're probably moving towards conceptual replications if we're making changes to the original study procedures. There's also an issue of the poor reporting of results or reporting inconsistencies. Lots of studies don't report all the relevant statistical analysis and outcomes. For example, when we were doing our pilot testing, many of the studies we looked at didn't report T values or F values. And lastly, then, of course, we will need more funding for our replication studies as we want to try and help out the volunteer labs with maybe the equipment or consumable costs, if any, because, we want this to be as easy as possible for labs and them to have a minimal cost. So we are open to any conversations about solutions if anybody has any ideas to overcome these barriers, but hopefully as we move through the different phases of the project, we may be able to adapt to these as well. So in conclusion, I guess we need help. It's a pretty ambitious project and it's quite a big undertaking. So therefore we need volunteers to try and come on board with us and help to run the replication studies. And of course, we need people to try and spread the information and spread the word as much as possible as well. So I've just given a very brief overview, and so I hope it wasn't too much information in such a short period. But if you have any questions or feedback, or even if there's something you don't agree with that I've spoken about, we'd love to get all the feedback we can get. So get in touch with us. You can contact us via our webpage, or you can contact me by email as well. So I think we probably should have some time for questions. And even if we do run out of time as well, just contact me if you have anything that you want to share. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That's such a massive project, and I think it's exactly what our field needs and really fascinating. The chat is already taking off. I can see I had perhaps the first question. I think Joe has already kind of addressed that. Sure, I'll throw it out to you as well, and then maybe continue down in order. I was just wondering about the. I work a bit in sports nutrition or with sports supplements. There are certain studies that have where guidelines are based on, say, meta-analytic estimates, and in effect, for certain supplements, there's already been multiple replications in certain ways, in which case I would consider any one single perhaps lower priority than in other areas. I'm just thinking in terms of, I see Brian Saunders is here. He's just completed a massive meta-analysis on sodium bicarbonate. I think, what was there, 200 odd studies included in that, Brian? So in effect, bicarbonate on particular exercise testing protocol have already been done, in which case I would consider that maybe lower priority to replicate than, say, some other more emerging. And I was just wondering the thoughts on that in terms of the overall level of knowledge or understanding in the area, and if that is perhaps worth considering as a criteria for selection.
Yeah, so we did have a big debate about this when we were putting together our selection protocols, and we thought about, you know, maybe trying to have some sort of assessment of replication value out there. A lot of previous literature had looked at citation counts and things like that, for example. But I guess really for us, you know, we are trying to present an unbiased overview, and we really did want to try and decrease the bias as much as possible. So when we were kind of moving towards the replication, or the replication value, it was kind of moving towards a little bit of a biased area. So for example, we did originally talk about having a criteria that maybe if it had been included in a systematic review or a meta-analysis, maybe we wouldn't include it in our final pool of studies then. But then that kind of got us talking about, you know, how close is close enough? You know, how similar does the research question have to be in a study to be considered like sufficiently answered by, you know, a systematic review and meta-analysis and things like that? And even, I guess, because we do suffer a lot from overestimated effect sizes because of publication bias and, you know, our small sample sizes, you know, a lot of the studies going into some of these systematic reviews and meta-analysis may be overestimated anyway. So the meta-analysis may not be a good measure of the evidence for that effect size as well. So we were kind of getting into very murky ground, I guess, with it. So
it's more and more complicated.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And mostly that we didn't have sufficient justification or, you know, a solid enough criteria for determining how close a research question had to be to consider it replicated previously. So I think in order to kind of step back and try and again make sure we had a representative pool of studies and an unbiased kind of overview, that's why we kind of stepped away from replication value. And even for those, you know, previous studies that had talked about quantifying replication value as a measure of citation counts and things, because we're only including research from a pretty recent 5 years, that would be really biased towards, you know, maybe the older studies, which may have had a higher citation count as well. So there was so many bias traps, and like we felt that if we couldn't properly justify or have a solid criterion for anything, then it probably wasn't worth us actually including in our selection protocol.
Guys, I'm going to suggest the chat is going too quick for me to come up with. Will we just go with the hand raising? In which case, I think Denver will be the next question, and we can have a look at the chat after.
Yeah, I think I just got confused a bit in terms of your replication project. So just to ensure that I'm on the same page here, you're looking to do pretty well exactly what Brian Nosek did in the broader field of psychology.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm curious where you give us a bit of a broad definition of how you'll select your studies. Like, what is relevance? So I'm trying to think about things from what is relevant. You know, there are plenty of debates across sports science, and Emir brought one up right away. Maybe that's a better way to go about it, or maybe not, but looking at things where there is a debate about whether these effects are true or not, you know, things like mental fatigue or ego depletion, or whether there are differences in affect and enjoyment in response to HIIT versus moderate intensity exercise. Maybe that's a way to think of the relevance and really answer some questions and decide whether we keep looking at these things or we move on after we've settled these debates.
Yeah, like, and as I mentioned, I suppose we thought about lots of different routes for our selection protocol. And I guess the reason that we're not selecting particular landmark effects or, particular popular effects, as you said, where there may be questions about, or, people want to see updated evidence on them, is basically that I guess we don't really know how to do that without completely invoking selection bias. And, I guess we're basing a lot of our methods and updated methods of previous replication projects, such as the reproducibility project in psychology and many labs as well. And I don't know, have you read much of the criticism of their projects, but they were really heavily criticized for selecting particular effects to replicate as well. So we kind of, I guess, because that seemed to be a common criticism across the previous replication projects, I think we really wanted to ensure that our selection protocol stepped away from that selection bias as well. And I guess, I did mention it in the presentation, I just feel that this is probably the first natural step for us to just give a field-wide assessment of replicability, because selecting those particular effects or popular effects may not necessarily be applicable to the whole field.
Yeah, I think there's two sides of the coin there. You have these
relevant
studies like
Brian
did, whereas if you choose them completely at random, people could say, that study, like, who even cares about that? Or maybe there's not even been a citation on that study. So what is its impact? Not saying that's exact, but final question for you is, will you at your university be replicating these studies as well?
Yeah, so we do hope to individually do our own replications as well. And of course, I think that's probably heavily based on how many volunteer labs we have to manage as well. Of course, if we get, lots of volunteer labs, we're only a small research group. So if the management is getting quite difficult with that, we may have to kind of push that out to maybe the next phase or the phase after. But of course, we do hope to run our own replication studies as well.
Yeah, just thinking from a buy-in standpoint, it might be challenging to get people to do it all for you. And you're like, but I'm not.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And of course, as part of my project, I do want to run a replication study as well. And we talked about this numerous times, even when we were putting together the proposal for this project. How could we make sure that this wasn't a complete workload for other labs? Because we know what we're asking them to do, and we are asking them to come on board and volunteer with us. And we're just hoping that, I guess, enough people are passionate about replicating and probably improving the quality of the research that we are doing. And as I mentioned, we are trying to incorporate some balance there by using the stratified random sampling method, so that there should be minimal costs, and we are hoping to get some external funding as well. So we are really, really aware of, making sure that everything is as smooth as possible for the volunteer labs. And that's why we're going to have, everything is going to be transparently reported to them, and hopefully they'll be completely clear on all methods as well.
Yeah, I think it's a great endeavor. Thanks.
I'm not actually seeing hands. I'm not sure where that function is on Zoom. So if you've got a hand up, feel free to just unmute and ask a question. Otherwise, I'll jump back into the chat here. Question from Brian. How closely will participant samples need to be matched? Will this be considered an additional, more stringent inclusion-exclusion criteria in the new study to ensure it's as similar as possible? For example, if the original paper says trained cyclists, will you try to advise that you actually match on, say, VO2 max or something like that, or some equivalent?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, I guess, to answer right now, because we don't really know what studies are going to end up in our final pool as well. And of course, because we are going to try and replicate everything as closely as possible. So therefore, with that example of a trained cyclist, if they can recruit a population or a sample that is, close in terms of VO2 max, well then fantastic, the closer the better. But then if it was a case where maybe they were obviously untrained cyclists, or maybe a different age range, then I guess that is kind of purposely moving away from the original sample as well. So it will try and be as close as possible, but I guess, you know, it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be some labs that are going to be able to run closer replications than others. And I guess the one thing that we've been told from Ryan Ozak is just to make sure we transparently report absolutely everything. So if there is a case that, you know, you can recruit trained cyclists, but they have a slight different mean in their VO2 max, for example, well, then we'll just report that. You know, I think there's a great template there in Mark Brandt's replication recipe where you have to report all those differences as well. So anything we're doing, we're just going to make sure it's completely transparent.
I'm now totally out of order, but I'm jumping on random questions and comments. The last one there, Rosie, that seems like a really interesting comment about closed door debates. Do you have any examples in terms of where that's kind of happening, where there's consensus outside but debate inside, or is that controversial? You're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, it might be a bit controversial.
I
more just mean yeah, just involvement in previous labs, I guess, as well, would kind of lead you to think that the replication of those studies wouldn't necessarily be successful, but there might not be debate in the literature. So I had another kind of comment. I hate to do the comment rather than question. I know that you, Jenny, deal with this in your protocol, but I think like the selection of the requirement for studies to have clear methods and a minimum reporting in the results probably leads to studies that are higher quality and might increase the likelihood of replication. But I know that's something that you've already considered in your protocol. And then the other thing I was wondering about is like bigger picture. Do you have a plan, assuming that the replication isn't, that where the project isn't going to result in really high perfect replications? What's the knowledge translation plan for that finding? Is there like a wider knowledge translation plan so that those results actually result in a change in practice, or will you involve kind of journals in changing their minimum requirements for anything?
That's a good question. You've kind of stumped me on that. I guess I haven't really thought that far ahead. I've been so focused on planning for this specific project. And I guess you would like to think so. You know, it's something that we definitely need to talk about. You know, we don't want to just produce this final report and potentially, if there is a, you know, if the replicability of the field is quite low, we don't want to just leave the final report out there with no change. And I think we're reporting enough, or we plan on reporting enough information so that this may potentially, you know, inform reporting guidelines in journals. So for example, if we, for the original authors, if we have to constantly go back about information to do with their sample, their procedures, anything, to be honest, if we're going to report all that information as well. So obviously, if, you know, the response rates is low, if we constantly have to go back to the original authors of this, we are going to report all this information, and with the idea that it will inform some sort of reporting guidelines, but we don't have something specific in place for it, I guess. Joe, do you want to add any more?
I would just add that, I mean, the end goal ultimately is just to produce some kind of consensus statement on the state of replicability in the field, yeah. And based on cumulative evidence of what we've garnered, both from, you know, the major replication project, but also, as Jenny mentioned briefly, you know, we'll have also a survey based on the people's perception of replication, but also Christian will be doing a fairly extensive systematic review on the level of reporting quality across all quartiles of journal tiers. So if we combine all of this knowledge together, we should be at a pretty good point to be able to put out a reasonably well evidence-based proposal for how our field can improve across all practices. Where we put that, what journal, what avenue we take is not something we've considered.
I think that outcome would be great.
You know, and we have to account here also for the fact that we may find that the level of replication in our field is reasonably high. I mean, I still maintain that most of the research that we do would more likely result in a moderate to high effect size just based on the way that studies are designed, or the tested effects that we observe. So it may be somewhat different than the more experimental research in psychology, and it may not.
I think that was actually a thought that I just had there in terms of, so I'm using I'm thinking now we've just had a paper accepted. It's an individual data meta-analysis on a particular supplement and particular exercise test. But what we're seeing generally, and default in the sport supplement area, is relatively small effects, but huge variability. So I think in terms of sampling error, there might be quite high replication, but in terms of practical applications of that, the general consensus on a lot of things seems to be that there is probably a fairly small effect, but really that will range massively. So I think sampling error is likely to be a challenge, and potentially some of the stats guys that are here might know an awful lot more than me on that. But I think the nature of what we test, particularly things like, say, capacity-based tests, so variable by themselves. I think a lot of replications will fall within the kind of the original estimates, but the fact that those original estimates are so wide in the first place might be an issue, or is an issue more generally for our discipline. I'm not fully sure if that makes sense or not sure if it's a relevant point.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing that we hopefully will be able to counteract in that point is by using the lower bound estimate of the effect sizes. It means that we'll probably have fairly inflated sample sizes that we'll be targeting in all of the replications. So if your point is true, then at least we will have a much more robust estimate of this true effect. Even if it is a variable effect, we will have much more confidence in the veracity of that finding, as with use Jenny's quote. So, I mean, again, that stabs us in the back, because by asking labs now to recruit much higher sample sizes in the original studies, we now have that big barrier of access, which is asking people to do a lot more work.
Actually, yeah, that's sorry, I'm hijacking the conversation now. Is there an upper limit in terms of the sample sizes? Like, say, for example, you identify that you need 200 people to identify an effect. I think most labs would be like, well, I'm happy to be involved, but I can't collect 200 people. Do you plan to put an upper limit in terms of just how big can you go in terms of sample sizes?
Yeah, we've had this conversation because, again, of course, we want to make it as feasible as possible for labs. And in our sample size planning, and even in our statistical calculation methods, you know, we have a plan A, B, and C, because it really depends on, you know, the original effect size and the sample as well. But you know, we will definitely be flexible with labs. So I know I've said our target is probably very high powered studies, 95%. But of course, again, depending on the original sample size and effect size, you know, the high powered study of 95% using Anderson and Kelly's method might be crazy high. So we will consider having to bring it back to maybe 90% or possibly 85%. It's difficult to know right now. And again, these are conversations we'll probably have with each individual lab as well, because we do want it to be, again, as easy as possible for them, but they do have to be high powered as well. So we'll try and find a balance between them, I guess.
I think we're coming towards the hour. Did I miss any? Did we miss any? I see there's some conversations going on in the chat that we probably don't have time to dig into. But did we miss any important questions? Does anybody want to follow up on anything?
Did we answer if the replication fails, will that study be replicated again?
Not within our research. So we'll only be doing a single replication of the effect. Of course, if it's, you know, from then on, if it's an effect that is really interesting to someone in particular within somebody's field, by all means, but no, we will only be doing single replications.
I just have a follow-up. Like, what about, so matching the subjects, but what about like equal studies with different genders, or like, since a lot of research tends to be done on college-age males, right? So is there any, are you guys going to put in, you know, variability of subject populations in that, or?
I guess you know, if it is college age males in the original study, we're going to have to follow that sample and the characteristics as close as possible, because if we, you know, purposely include females or different numbers, then we're moving towards a conceptual replication. And I guess the kind of the line between close and conceptual replication, it's quite blurry, because, you know, of course, for conceptual replications, it's a purposeful deviation. And then with close replications, it's only changes that are completely unavoidable. But that probably wouldn't be classed as an unavoidable change where we could recruit college-age males.
I just had a quick comment, if I can. Congratulations, Jenny, Joe, and Christian and team for such an ambitious project. Looks pretty ambitious and fascinating that you putting this together. I just made a quick comment in the chat if you were going to consider the level of expertise of the researchers that will be involved in your studies. In social and cognitive psychology, it seems that replication teams with a higher expertise tend to find bigger effect sizes. So I was just wondering if you're gonna take that into consideration.
Yes, of course we will. So in those kind of stratified pools within our larger pool of studies for replication, they will be stratified by expertise as well. You know, we can't, I guess, well, that's a good question too, James. How is expertise operationally defined? But I guess we're not going to be expecting, you know, a nutritionist to replicate a study that for a biomechanist, you know, or anything like that. So I guess, you know, we will try and stratify as best we can with them as well, with the stratified pools, and match them too. Yeah. But it's probably, you know, I think social psychology is a little bit different. I feel like there may be kind of more easily defined subject areas and expertise here, but maybe we'll see once we get into our selection of the studies.
Yeah, the papers I was thinking of, they kind of categorize them by the number of studies published that included experiments, something like that. So I guess it was kind of the expertise of having hands-on in the laboratory setting, or I guess in those areas of psychology. Sometimes you're not in a lab collecting data, but yeah, but having experience with the process of data collection, I guess so.
Yeah, I guess papers kind of as a, well, not as a measure of expertise, is not really something we considered. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, when we are going to be recruiting in the labs, and, you know, when they are filling in their expression of interest form, they will put down all the equipment they have available, the software, manufacturer details, all that kind of information. But I guess we'd also be looking for that information. So what would they feel they are most comfortable replicating, or what would they consider their own area of expertise? And I guess that's probably how we would define it. What would they consider their area of expertise?
Right, yeah, great. Thank you.
I might just add just two comments. Obviously, the first thing here from a practical point of view is, in order for us to closely do that, the one thing we'll try and do is to, of course, exactly match the hardware and resources available for each of the studies. That does require on our end a fairly substantial budget. And so my first request from you guys is, if any of you are aware of any funding bodies that you think would love to be involved in this type of movement. I mean, there's a huge interest in all fields on open science and transferability and cooperation and everything else. We would very much welcome to hear about funding opportunities. We're applying for everything that we possibly can, but the realistic nature of the scope of this study means if we don't get some degree of funding, it probably won't happen. And secondly, you know, as many people have already identified here, it is an extremely ambitious project. Often I wonder why I ever thought we could do this. But yeah, they'll hate me by the end. But of course, the whole premise of success in this project is based on cooperation of labs. And so if I could ask you guys at all, if you can like, share, promote as much as you can, contact colleagues, ask them if there's any way they can get involved. I mean, without you guys, without other labs cooperating, this project will not happen. And so if we can get any assistance there at all, we'd be very grateful.
Cool. I think that we're probably already going a little over time. I wonder if potentially there was a couple of more kind of specific focus questions, detailed questions in the chats, in terms of, for example, how would you handle things if the original authors don't, a question from Gabrielle Barreto, if the original authors just don't control for something that we know should be controlled, for example, voucher control. But I wonder if perhaps, Jenny, Joe, if we send some of those questions after, we could share the transcript like we've done. Oh yeah, absolutely. Because I think that we'll really be getting into the details there that maybe will put us way beyond time. So are we okay with that? Is that everything? Yep. Guys, just dates for the diaries for the next short while. On May 5th, we've got Daniel Umpierre from here in Brazil, who's going to talk about the Strengthening Evidence in Exercise Science initiative. We've got James Steele, who's right here, not next week, May 19th, is leading a journal club discussion on Tagliacone's recent generalizability crisis paper. And we've also got some really nice talks coming up in June and July. We've got Brett Smith is going to talk about qualitative research methods and openness in qualitative research. I think it's really important. Graham Close on research translation, James Betts on reporting, Amanda Hagstrom on sex bias. I'm trying to think off the top of my head now. We've got a lot of cool stuff coming on. So if you're not already following us, make sure to follow us on Twitter or to sign up as a member to keep up to date with those forthcoming events.
Right.